Rome wasn't just an empire of emperors and senators. It was also a place where common folk lived, laughed, loved, and died. So let's talk about what the average Roman got up to in their everyday life. Imagine walking down a street, but instead of cars and people in a hurry, there are crowds of people, carts, and animals, all making noise. The air is thick with the smell of cooking food and waste. That's what it would have been like to walk down a street in ancient Rome. There were no real sidewalks, so pedestrians shared the roads with carts and wagons. Horse-drawn carts were the main form of transportation. They were used to carry goods and people, and the roads were typically only wide enough for one cart at a time. So be prepared to get out of the way when one came barreling down the road towards you. But what did these carts and wagons haul? Well, that depends on who was driving them. Carts pulled by oxen or other large animals were used for heavy loads, while those pulled by horses carried lighter loads or were used for racing. Slaves or freed people often drove carts or wagons. They were usually identified by a badge they wore on their clothing that designated their occupation. In the case of a cart driver, the badge might look like a yoke or a whip. The roads weren't the only crowded places in Roman cities. Markets were also bustling hubs of activity. They were the center of social life, a place to buy necessities and gossip with friends. If you wanted to buy meat in the Roman Empire, you had to go to the butcher shop. Butchers were usually slaves because the job was dangerous. After all, they were working with sharp knives and angry customers. If you were a customer, you brought your own knife to butcher your meat. Butchers didn't cut up the meat for you. They sold it to you whole, whether it was a pig, a cow, or a sheep. Then you took it home and cooked it yourself. Not every Roman could afford meat, though. Most poor people were vegetarians because they couldn't afford meat or dairy products. Instead, they ate lots of bread, fruit, and vegetables. You'd probably recognize many of the foods Romans ate, including grapes, figs, apples, pears, olives, beans, lentils, onions, garlic, and cabbage. They also ate foods we don't eat much today, such as snails and dormice. Some of these dishes sound pretty disgusting, like roasted peacock with pepper and vinegar or boiled donkey with chickpeas. Yum! While most Romans were vegetarians, wealthy Romans loved meat. They enjoyed pork, beef, lamb, goat, and poultry. They also liked seafood, which was easy to come by since Rome was surrounded by water on three sides. Roman emperors were especially fond of fish. When Emperor Nero was throwing one of his famous parties, he reportedly served 5,000 oysters to his guests. Another emperor, Augustus, hosted a banquet for 8 people. He sent 2 men out to sea to catch 8 different kinds of fish. They came back with 4,000 fish, one of each kind, and Augustus served them up at dinner. If you were a wealthy Roman, you might eat off gold plates and drink from golden goblets, although silver was more common among the elite. But even if you were rich, you wouldn't necessarily eat with a fork and knife. You could use a spoon, but more often than not, you used your hands. Eating with your hands was considered more manly and allowed you to get more food into your mouth. This also meant that you needed to hire servants to serve you, unless you were a poor person. In that case, you likely ate alone. What about dessert? Romans liked to end their meals with something sweet. They enjoyed fruit, nuts, and honey for dessert. Sometimes they mixed honey with flour and vinegar to make a kind of pancake called placenta. The wealthy could afford more exotic desserts, like pastry cups filled with nuts and spices. One recipe calls for cutting the tops off ripe pomegranates, filling them with a mixture of chopped nuts and honey, then adding small cakes made from flour, wine, and cheese. That sounds pretty delicious. And if it didn't spoil, it could last for weeks. Now that you know what Romans ate, let's talk about what they wore. Women wore dresses called tunics that reached their ankles. They wore them with a girdle around their waist and a cloak draped over their shoulders. Wealthy women wore jewelry made of gold and precious stones. They also wore makeup, usually made from flowers or plants. For example, women crushed the petals of the anemone flower to make a red lip color. Women used cosmetics for more than just decoration. They believed it protected their skin from the sun and wind. In fact, they believed cosmetics had healing powers. The Greek physician Dioscorides wrote that women used a cream made of flour and vinegar to treat acne. Men in the Roman Empire wore tunics too, but theirs were shorter. Their tunics reached their knees and left their legs free so they could move around easily. Men also wore togas, which were a big rectangle of fabric draped over the shoulder. A metal clasp kept the toga in place. Toga colors varied depending on the occasion. For example, white was worn for funerals. You'd think people would want to wear bright colors to a funeral to lift the mood. But in Roman times, white symbolized mourning. Senators wore a special type of toga called a toga praetexta, which had purple stripes. Only senators and magistrates were allowed to wear this type of toga. If someone else wore it, they would be put to death. Being fashionable in Roman times wasn't cheap. Clothing was expensive, so most Romans didn't change their clothes very often. They would patch up their old tunics and togas instead of buying new ones. Also, most Romans weren't very tall, so when the clothes of the deceased were found, they were usually buried with them. The living could then reuse the clothes, saving their family money. Now that you know what Romans wore, let's take a look at how they built their houses. Most wealthy Romans lived in apartment buildings called insulae, while the poor lived in simple homes made of wood and brick. The wealthy favored marble and limestone for their homes. These materials were expensive, but they lasted a long time and they looked impressive. Many Roman houses had a courtyard in the center, which provided light and air to the rooms. The courtyard was surrounded by columns and arches. This design was an innovation of the Romans. The Greeks had used columns and capitals in their architecture, but the Romans were the first to use arches and vaults. They also developed concrete, which allowed them to build larger structures without having to use wood. Concrete was made from crushed stone, volcanic ash, and lime. It was strong and fireproof, so it was ideal for building houses in earthquake-prone areas. Houses in the Roman Empire also featured elaborate plumbing systems. They had indoor toilets, public bathrooms with heated floors, fountains, and pools. The wealthy also had private baths in their homes. These baths were more than just for cleanliness. They were a place to socialize and relax. Rich Romans spent hours bathing and drinking wine in their baths. They had slaves to wait on them while they reclined on benches or lounged in beds. Speaking of lounging, many Roman houses had furniture designed for reclining. They had couches and chairs that could be adjusted to any position. In fact, some couches could be turned into beds. Dinner was also a more leisurely affair in Rome. Meals were served on low tables, and guests reclined while they ate. Slaves waited on them and turned the tables to make eating easier. What do you find most interesting about Roman culture? Tell me in the comments below. And before you go, remember to like this video and subscribe for more. Until next time, adios.